What if the moment the world expected Germany to stall in the snow, the invasion didn't stall at all? Picture it, late 1941. Instead of bogging down outside Moscow, German logistics hold. The winter gear arrives early, fuel shortages are eased, and, most importantly, the Soviet command structure fractures under the pressure. It's not just one city falling. It's the loss of coordination, the kind of cascading failure that turns a brutal campaign into a successful one. In this alternate timeline, Moscow is taken, not as a single decisive checkmate, but as the nerve center that suddenly stops transmitting clean signals. Rail hubs are seized, communications break, reserves are misdirected, and as panic spreads, a hard truth becomes unavoidable. The Soviet Union can still fight, but it can no longer fight as one. Now, let's be careful. Successful doesn't mean easy, clean, or quick. Even in victory, the invasion is catastrophic, and the scale of displacement, hunger, and violence is immense. But for the purposes of this counterfactual, Germany achieves what it never did in our timeline. It forces the Soviet state into collapse, fragmentation, or an armistice that effectively ends organized resistance across the Western Soviet heartland. So what changes first? The first shift is psychological. The war stops looking like a two-front gamble for Germany and starts looking like an awful, grinding consolidation. Berlin no longer expects a Soviet counteroffensive that can roll back the front hundreds of miles. Instead, Germany and its allies occupy enormous territory, and with it, they inherit a problem bigger than any battlefield: governance. The second shift is economic. With Western Soviet industry disrupted, Germany tries to redirect resources, grain, coal, oil, into an imperial supply chain. But conquest doesn't automatically turn into usable output. Rail gauges don't match. Skilled labor is missing or displaced. Partisan activity makes every bridge and depot a point of failure. And the deeper the occupation spreads, the more security forces are required just to keep trains moving. Still, even a partial extraction of resources changes the strategic math. The Reich gains time. Time to rebuild air power, time to strengthen coastal defenses, time to push research and production. And time, in a world war, is a weapon. Now look west. Britain, isolated, battered, but unbroken, faces a nightmare scenario. No massive Eastern Front consuming German manpower at the same scale. The Atlantic becomes even more dangerous. U-boat production rises. Long-range aircraft patrol the approaches. Convoys suffer heavier losses. Britain can still endure, but the margin for error narrows to a thread. The United States, watching from across the ocean, confronts a different choice. In our timeline, the Soviet Union's survival kept Germany tied down and gave the Allies a partner on land. Here, that partner is gone, or fragmented into unstable successor states, contested territories, and desperate resistance movements. The U.S. might still enter the war, especially if events in the Pacific play out similarly, but the European theater becomes a longer, more expensive project. So does Germany invade Britain? Probably not in the way people imagine. A cross-channel landing is still an enormous risk. Naval supremacy remains the barrier, and Britain's geography is a fortress. Instead, Germany leans into strangulation, air raids, submarine warfare, and pressure on the Mediterranean, aiming to fracture British supply lines and political will. And that brings us to the Mediterranean pivot. With the East stabilized, Germany can redirect experienced units south, toward the Caucasus approaches already secured in part, toward the Middle East by proxy, and toward North Africa with a seriousness that earlier campaigns lacked. The goal becomes clear: disrupt British imperial roots, threaten oil access, and create a defensive belt that makes any future Allied landing staggeringly costly. But here's the crucial point. Even with the Soviet Union knocked out, Germany's core dilemma doesn't vanish. Occupying vast spaces drains strength. It doesn't create it. Every kilometer of front becomes a liability. Every city becomes a garrison requirement. Every act of resistance forces reprisals, and reprisals breed more resistance. The occupation becomes a slow-burning war inside the war. Meanwhile, the Allied advantage, industrial scale, still grows. The United States can outproduce nearly anyone if given time. Aircraft, ships, vehicles, fuel, munitions, delivered across oceans like a conveyor belt of steel. In this timeline, the Allies likely accelerate strategic bombing, not as a knockout punch, but as a long-term dismantling of Germany's ability to move, repair, and manufacture. So what does the middle of the 1940s look like? Imagine Europe split by an iron boundary, but not the one we know. Instead of Soviet influence spreading west, you have German dominance stretching east, layered with occupied zones, puppet administrations, and restive territories. In the west, Britain remains defiant, and the Atlantic becomes a grinding contest of shipyards versus submarines. The war doesn't end with a neat signing ceremony. It stretches, it hardens, and then the big question arrives: do the Allies land in Western Europe anyway? Yes, but later, and under worse conditions. With more German divisions available, coastal defenses in France, the Low Countries, and Norway become denser and smarter. The Allies respond with overwhelming air power, deception operations, and an even larger amphibious armada. The landing, when it comes, looks less like a bold gamble and more like a deliberate industrial assault, preceded by relentless strikes on rail nodes, bridges, fuel depots, and airfields. The cost is staggering. The timeline is longer. The civilian toll rises. And because there is no major Soviet advance from the east, liberation from German control depends almost entirely on Western Allied momentum and local resistance, fighting street by street. Now let's talk about the most volatile consequence, the end game. In our timeline, the race for Berlin shaped the post-war order. In this one, the race is different. It's a race to end a continent-wide occupation before it solidifies into something permanent. If the Allies can't crack the fortress quickly, the conflict risks becoming a protracted, multi-year struggle, part conventional war, part insurgency, part blockade. And hovering over all of it is the shadow of the bomb. The United States still pursues nuclear weapons. The first successful tests still change the rules of history. But how they are used, or even whether they are used, depends on how desperate the situation becomes. If Germany holds Western Europe at bay, and the war drags into the late 1940s, the pressure to force an end could become overwhelming. Not as a simple, clean solution. Nothing about this is clean. But as a terrifying escalation in a world that has run out of patience. Yet even here there's a sobering counterpoint. Nuclear weapons don't magically solve occupation, supply, and political legitimacy. They can end campaigns, shatter cities, and shock governments into surrender. But they can't rebuild a continent, feed millions, or keep a sprawling empire stable in peacetime. Which brings us to the paradox at the heart of a successful invasion. If Germany truly succeeds in the Soviet Union, it inherits an empire too large to secure without bleeding itself dry. It becomes stronger on maps and weaker in reality. The more territory it holds, the more it must police. The more it polices, the more it provokes. The more it provokes, the more violence it must use to maintain control. It's a cycle that consumes manpower, legitimacy, and resources. Over time, that kind of system tends to fracture, economically, politically, or both. Not because opposition is guaranteed to win quickly, but because the burden of permanent war footing is an acid that eats through even the most intimidating machinery. So what does the world look like if Barbarossa worked? It's a world with a longer war, a bloodier liberation, and a colder, more anxious global order afterward. One where the post-war balance isn't defined by two superpowers facing off across a divided Germany, but by a battered Atlantic alliance trying to stabilize Europe while managing the fallout of collapsed states in the East. Decolonization likely accelerates anyway, because European empires still bleed resources and credibility. But the pathway is messier, and the humanitarian crises are larger. And the final irony? A German victory in the East does not guarantee a German victory in the world. Industrial capacity, geography, and the sheer impossibility of controlling massive hostile territories still loom like immovable obstacles. Even in this alternate timeline, winning one campaign may only delay the reckoning. History doesn't just hinge on battles. It hinges on what comes after: administration, logistics, legitimacy, and the will of ordinary people forced to endure extraordinary brutality. If you want more cinematic alternate history deep dives like this, where we follow the consequences all the way to the end, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what turning point you want to rewrite next. And I'll see you in the next one.